The battle was over. The settlement was secure. The wreckage of the Ravager assault lay scattered at the base of the wall. But the real enemy was still inside him. It wasn't an alien or a traitor. It was the memory of what he'd done, a cold, permanent fact that lived in his chest. He stood among the survivors and felt completely alone. He'd saved them. But he couldn't save himself from the truth. The high gravity of Nexus Prime was nothing compared to the weight of it. It sat on him a constant pressure. He looked at the faces around him. People who had families. People who trusted each other. He was an imposter among them. A man carrying a secret that would poison their victory. He found Nixara near the main gate. She was cleaning her blade. Her golden skin was smeared with dirt and dark alien blood. He didn't speak for a long moment. He just watched the methodical way she worked. Finally, he said it. His voice was flat, empty. I terminated my family. He did not say I lost them or they died. He used a word of finality. A word of action. Termination. It was the plain, ugly fact of the stabilization array fracture back on the Europa mining hub. He had been the operator. The safety of the section was his direct responsibility. The inspection protocols for the structural supports were his to follow. He'd missed the critical defect. The stress indicators on his console had been blinking. He'd made a judgment call. A bad one. The strut gave way. The bulkhead failed. The compartment decompressed. There were no bodies to recover. Just a final security feed image of Lyra's hand reaching for Cassandra before the vacuum took them. His fault. His miscalculation. This wasn't a confession meant for forgiveness. He wasn't asking for her pity or her absolution. That wasn't the point. It was for accuracy. It was about aligning the external reality with the internal one. He was a man who had killed his own family through a failure of attention. That was the data. To pretend otherwise was a lie. He needed her to know the truth of the man she was now allied with. A man whose greatest victory was an accident of survival. A man whose defining act was one of catastrophic loss. The admission did something strange. It didn't make the weight heavier. It changed the weight. It shifted from a punishment he was serving to a purpose he could serve. It was no longer about enduring his guilt. It was about using it. The memory of their faces, of the silence that followed the breach, was no longer a ghost that haunted him. It became a compass. He couldn't bring Lyra and Cassandra back. That was an absolute. But he could prevent other families from being shattered. He could stop other men from making his mistake. He could use his knowledge, his painful, hard-won understanding of failure, to build something that wouldn't break. His strength, the defiance he'd found in the jungle, wasn't for conquest. It wasn't for fighting wars or claiming territory. It was for containment. It was a living wall against danger. It was a system of checks against the kind of blind, arrogant confidence that had led to the array fracture. He would be the safeguard he failed to be. His life would be a monument to prevention. Every defense he helped build, every risk he helped mitigate, would be a silent apology written in action. The truce between them hardened into a permanent exchange. It wasn't about trust. It was about utility. Knowledge was a currency, and both of them had unique reserves. Marcus started with the basics. He taught them what he knew from Earth. He explained structural integrity, how to calculate load-bearing stress, how to distribute weight across a framework. He showed them defensive geometry, the angles of attack, the dead zones, the best sight lines for a sentry. He used charcoal on flat stones to sketch diagrams. The settlers watched. They learned Nixara gave them the world. She taught them how to listen to the jungle, to read the subtle shifts in the wind that meant a storm was coming, to understand the language of the crystals that grew everywhere. Some hummed with energy when pressure changed. Others emitted a low frequency before a ground tremor. She showed them which vines were strong enough to hold a bridge and which would snap under a man's weight. She knew the patterns of the predators, their hunting times, their territorial disputes. Her knowledge was not written down. It was lived. Their two systems began to merge. The settlement's fortifications changed. They stopped building walls to dominate the jungle. They started building structures that blended into it. They used the natural crystalline formations as anchors. They wove defensive perimeters into the existing tree lines. The result was a new kind of strength. It was subtle. It was organic. It made the settlement harder to see and harder to attack. They used the land instead of fighting it. Nixara's role shifted. The hunter became a strategist. Her precision, once used for a clean kill, found a new scale. She could look at Marcus's geometric diagrams and overlay them with her understanding of the terrain. She could predict how an enemy would move through a specific part of the forest based on the ground cover and the time of day. Her mind, trained for the immediate, learned to plan for the long term. Marcus's pain became a textbook. He didn't hide his failure, he used it. He told them about the stabilization array on Europa. He explained the missed inspection, the ignored stress indicators, the catastrophic result. It wasn't a story about grief. It was a lesson in systems failure, a case study in what happens when you get complacent. His personal tragedy became a community lesson in vigilance. They learned to double-check supports, to trust the warning signs, to never assume something is stable. Two broken systems began to form a single working whole. His external knowledge of physics and engineering provided the framework. Her internal knowledge of the planet provided the context. The settlers learned to build a watchtower that could withstand high winds because Marcus understood bracing, and they built it from a specific native wood Nixara knew wouldn't splinter. They created an early warning system that used both motion sensors from the Artemis's salvage and trained scouts who could read the alarm calls of native birds. It was a hybrid intelligence. Earth logic filtered through the harsh curriculum of Nexus Prime. They were no longer just surviving the environment. They were starting to understand it. They were building a civilization that belonged. Decades passed. The sheer effort of staying alive became routine. The routine became custom. The settlement was no longer a desperate camp. It was a village. Its walls were a living part of the jungle now, grown into and reinforced by the land itself. The fight for survival became the tradition of living. It was a quieter war, fought with knowledge instead of blood. Their children were the living proof of the change. Their skin held a bronze tint, a new shade that spoke of mixed heritage. Their bodies were different. They were born under the heavy gravity. Their bones were denser from the start. Their muscles adapted to the load. They grew up breathing the air, their lungs learning to filter the toxins more efficiently. They were a new thing, a blend of Earth's resilience and Nexus Prime's harsh finesse. They were native to this world in a way their parents could never be. Hybrid literacy was their first language. They learned Marcus's diagrams of structural stress alongside Nixara's teachings on predator migration. They read the hum of a pressure-sensitive crystal as easily as they read a charge level on a power cell. Earth's hard logic and the planet's intuitive wisdom were not separate subjects. They were a single, unified system for understanding their world. This was the core of the new civilization. A fusion of two ways of seeing. The memorial bond expanded. It wasn't just for the human dead anymore. The massive predator that Marcus had faced, the one they now called the Thantor, was honored. Its role was remembered. It was the first test. The first moment the planet's logic was challenged. Its crystalline form was carved into the main gate. It was a symbol of respect for a force of nature, not a thing to be conquered but a power to be understood. Danger was reframed into a form of respect. The village mindset shifted completely. They stopped thinking purely about defense. They started thinking about anticipation. They learned to read the subtle signs. A change in the vibration of a specific rock formation meant a ground shift was coming. A particular bird's call signaled a change in weather patterns long before the clouds gathered. They managed risk through deep understanding, not through stronger walls or bigger weapons. They didn't wait for the attack. They saw it coming and redirected it. The Emerald Jungle was no longer a hostile wilderness. It was a home. Its rules were complex, but they were knowable. The threats were still there. The predators still hunted. The ground still sometimes cracked open. But these were not acts of random malice. They were parts of a system. The villagers learned to navigate that system. They built their homes in safe zones they had mapped. They harvested resources without provoking the native life. They lived within the world's structure, not against it. The memory of the initial catastrophe, the crash, and the loss lost its sharp edge. The pain did not vanish. It transformed. It became a source of invention. Marcus's story of the mining array failure was a cautionary tale taught to every child. It was a lesson in vigilance that drove them to build better, to check their work twice, to trust the warning signs. The past was not a wound to be hidden. It was a textbook, a wellspring of hard lessons that fueled their desire to create a safer, stronger future. Their history was their greatest teacher. She mocked his earthborn frailty, certain he'd break under Nexus Prime's crushing gravity. But Marcus Vale carried more than just his own weight. He bore the memory of a dead family and a failure that haunted every breath. When a crystalline predator lunged, she expected him to flee. Instead, he did the one thing that would rewrite his story forever. Smoke rose from the Artemis's shattered hull, but the real wreckage was the man who crawled from it. Marcus Vale moved like something held together by memory alone. Each step sent fractures through his composure. The jungle air tasted of sulfur and regret, each breath scraping his lungs raw. He remembered the mining station on Europa, the last normal moment before everything ended. Lyra's hand in his, Cassandra's laugh echoing down the corridor. He had been at the controls when the stabilization array failed. One miscalculation, one hesitation, the struts gave way. The security feed showed it all. The collapse, the silence afterward. He replayed it in the toxic air of Nexus Prime. The gravity here felt familiar. It pressed down just like the weight of that failure. His body wasn't built for this world. Earth bones, meant for one gravity, now carried over twice that load. His joints ached like old machinery pushed past its limits. Every movement was a negotiation with pain. He didn't just feel the planet's pull. He felt it in the marrow, a deep and constant reminder of where he didn't belong. The escape pod was a tomb he'd narrowly left. Inside, the emergency beacon blinked. Useless, no one was coming. He was alone with the ghosts he brought with him. Their absence was a physical emptiness in his chest, sharper than the ache in his spine. Nexus Prime was writing its own story with him as the subject. The emerald leaves seemed to watch. The ground felt hostile under his boots. Each heartbeat was a countdown. He wasn't surviving. He was existing on borrowed time, a man already half gone before the planet even got to him. He found a stream with water that looked drinkable. His hands shook as he cupped it. The liquid was cold and carried a metallic tang. He drank anyway. Thirst was a more immediate problem than poison. His reflection in the water showed a face he barely recognized. Hollow eyes, a cut above his brow. The face of a man who had signed the death warrants of the only people who mattered. Darkness came fast. The jungle didn't sleep. Sounds echoed. Screeches, rustles, things moving in the canopy. He didn't bother with a fire. Light would only draw attention. He sat with his back against a thick-barked tree, every sense straining. The cold seeped through his suit. He thought about the warmth of the mining hub, the hum of machinery, the way Lyra would hum when she worked. Now there was only the hum of alien insects and the ache in his bones. He was a ghost in a world that had no use for specters. Survival required a future, and his had ended millions of miles away. He closed his eyes not to sleep but to endure. The planet was patient. It had time to break him completely. The air itself felt like a slow poison. Every breath Marcus took carried a metallic sting, a chemical burn that coated his throat. This wasn't just thin air. It was a hostile mix that forced his body to work twice as hard for half the oxygen. His lungs ached from the effort, a constant shallow burn that never eased. Each inhalation was a bargain, trading immediate oxygen for long-term cellular damage. He could feel the toxins accumulating, a gritty film on his tongue, a pressure behind his eyes. The ground under his feet wasn't just heavy. It actively pulled. 2.3 Gs. On Earth, he weighed 180. Here, it was over 400 pounds of constant downward force. Every step was a conscious act of will. His skeleton, evolved for a gentler world, groaned under the load. The calcium matrix of his bones, perfectly adequate for Earth, began developing microfractures almost immediately. It was a structural integrity problem his body couldn't solve. Walking felt less like movement and more like a slow-motion collapse. It changed the physics of everything. Picking up a rock the size of his fist felt like lifting a cinder block. The simple act of standing from a crouch required planning, a careful distribution of strain to avoid tearing muscle or snapping tendon. His heart labored, a heavy, sluggish pump fighting a gravity well it was never designed to overcome. The blood in his veins felt thick, slow, reluctant to climb back to his brain. Dizziness was a constant companion, a warning light blinking in his vision. The environment offered no reprieve. The soil held unfamiliar crystalline structures that glittered with a deceptive beauty. He didn't know if they were sharp enough to slice through his boot soles, or if contact would trigger a corrosive reaction. A purple moss growing on a fallen log emitted a faint, sweet scent that made his head swim. He gave it a wide berth. Every plant, every mineral was an unknown variable in a lethal equation. This world didn't have a learning curve. It had an elimination process. Survival here wasn't about bravery. Bravery required a belief in a possible outcome. This was about endurance. It was about seeing how many hours he could last before the cumulative damage became irreversible. The gravity would eventually crush his circulatory system. The atmosphere would scar his lungs beyond function. He wasn't navigating a new ecosystem. He was weathering a sustained multidisciplinary attack. His body was the battlefield, and it was losing on every front. He moved through the emerald gloom not as an explorer, but as a man serving out a death sentence passed by an entire planet. The jungle watched, patient and utterly indifferent to his struggle. She came without a sound. He only knew she was there when the light changed. A tall figure stood at the edge of the clearing, skin the color of burnished gold, watching him try to stand. Her eyes scanned his trembling legs, the sweat on his brow, the obvious strain in his posture. She made no move to help. Her voice came out flat, devoid of emotion, like a machine reading a diagnostic report. She spoke his death in a language he shouldn't have understood, yet the meaning was clear in her tone. Your structure is flawed. Your bones are porous. They lack the crystalline lattice that binds ours. They will fragment under this pressure. She wasn't guessing. She was stating a confirmed result. To her, he was a walking anatomy lesson in evolutionary failure. She had seen his kind before. Fragile visitors who came in metal shells thinking their technology made them strong. They always broke. The planet did the work for her. Her presence here was just a formality, a witness to the inevitable. You will not last a single rotation. The weight will compact your spine. Your organs will collapse under their own mass. You are already dead. You just haven't stopped moving yet. She didn't say it with malice. There was no pleasure in her assessment. It was pure, cold logic. Her people had spent generations adapting to this brutal environment. Their skeletons had restructured, incorporating the planet's own minerals for reinforcement. Their lungs filtered the toxins as a natural function. They were the product of this world's harsh curriculum. He was the opposite, a relic from a softer place, a living example of why her people's isolation was necessary. Off-worlders brought nothing but weakness and a swift, messy end. Her certainty was absolute. It was the certainty of a hunter who has seen the same outcome 100 times. The prey always falls. The only variable is how long it struggles. Her laughter, when it came, was a short, sharp sound. It wasn't meant to mock. It was the sound of someone observing a fundamental error. A man trying to breathe water, a bird trying to walk. His very existence here was the joke. He was a violation of the natural order, and the order was correcting itself. She turned to leave. Her job was done. She had confirmed what she already knew. There was no fight to be had, no challenge to meet. He was a problem that would solve itself within hours. She disappeared back into the thick foliage as silently as she arrived, leaving him alone with the crushing weight of her verdict. The truth of it settled on him, heavier than the gravity. She hadn't threatened him. She had just told him the time. The ache in his legs wasn't new. He'd felt it before, a deep muscular burn that went beyond fatigue. It was the same sensation he'd had in his arms and back, fighting the manual override on the mining array's central column. The memory was a physical thing, a ghost pain that lived in his tissue. He gasped for air and the sound echoed in his skull. Not the clean rasp of a man pushing his limits, but the ragged, desperate heave of someone drowning. It was the same sound Lyra made when the pressure door jammed. A short, sharp intake of air that was more shock than breath. Cut off before it finished. The toxic air of Nexus Prime burned, but the memory burned hotter. The gravity pressed down and he felt it in his shoulders first. A deep structural stress. It was the exact weight he'd felt through the hydraulic levers in his hands. The stabilization strut on the Europa mining hub had weighed tons, but the feedback through the controls translated it into a resistance you felt in your bones. He'd been fighting that resistance when the strut gave way. The console had flashed a structural integrity warning a second before the whole section sheared off. His hands had been on the controls. His decision, his miscalculation. He wasn't just fighting a planet. He was back in that control room watching the safety indicators blink from green to red. The jungle faded. He saw the metal corridor of the hub, the vibration under his feet. the look on Lyra's face through the viewport as she realized the bulkhead wouldn't hold. He heard the shriek of tearing metal, a sound that started low and climbed into a frequency that felt like it would crack his teeth. Then the rush of air, short and violent, and the silence that followed. A silence so complete it was louder than the explosion. They were on the other side of that door. His wife, his daughter. Their safety was his job. The array's stability was his responsibility. He had one task. He failed it. The planet's gravity was just a reminder, a physical echo of the weight that had been on him since that moment. This wasn't an accident he survived. It was a failure he carried. Every step on Nexus Prime was a punishment. The planet was just the instrument. The sentence had been passed months ago, millions of miles away. He deserved the ache in his bones. He deserved the poison air. He deserved to be broken by the weight. It was justice. A life for a life. 2 lives. His body was failing, but his mind was sharp. He remembered the exact pressure reading on the main reactor. He remembered the course correction he'd decided against, thinking it was an overreaction. He remembered the confidence in his own judgment. That confidence had killed them. The memory was perfect. It played behind his eyes in high definition. Every second, every detail. The Golden Hunter thought the gravity would kill him. She was wrong. The memory would kill him first. It was a ghost that didn't just haunt him. It inhabited him. It was the real weight he could never put down. The undergrowth parted without a sound. The creature that stepped into the clearing had 6 limbs, each one tipped with crystalline formations that caught the weak light. It moved with a fluid economy. Its muscles coiled under a hide of dark iridescent scales. The high gravity meant nothing to it. Its body was built for the constant pressure. Its bones reinforced with the same mineral structures that grew from the ground. It was a perfect product of this world. It didn't look at Marcus with anger or hunger. Its multifaceted eyes scanned him with a cold analytical focus. It was assessing. To this creature, he wasn't a threat or a person. He was a biological anomaly, a malfunction in the system, a weak point in the ecosystem that needed to be pruned. Its purpose wasn't to feed. It was to test. This was the planet's final examination, and he was failing it. Nixara watched from the shadows. Her expression was unchanged. This was the expected outcome. The logical conclusion to the story of an off-worlder. The creature would charge. The man would run. The run would be short. His earth-born lungs would fail. His brittle legs would buckle. The predator would finish its work. It was a simple, efficient process. She had seen it before. But Marcus didn't run. The part of his brain that calculated survival odds, the part that valued self-preservation, had shut down a long time ago. It died in the silence after the bulkhead gave way on Europa. Logic was a language he no longer spoke. All that remained was a deep, stubborn refusal. He wouldn't run from another failure. He wouldn't add cowardice to his list of crimes. The creature lowered its head. The crystalline spikes on its forelimbs gleamed. It wasn't posturing. It was preparing. Its charge wasn't an act of rage. It was a function. A final step in a diagnostic process. The planet had issued its verdict. This was the execution. It moved. The ground trembled under its weight. It covered the distance between them in 3 powerful strides, each one perfectly balanced for the heavy world. Its body was a weapon honed by generations of evolutionary pressure. It was fast, but to Marcus the world seemed to slow down. He saw the dust kick up from its claws. He saw the focus in its alien eyes. He didn't see an end. He saw a moment. One last chance to choose how he fell. He planted his feet. The action sent a jolt of pain through his ankles. His knees protested. His spine compressed under the strain. He was a statue of flawed design, waiting for the impact. He didn't brace for the hit. He braced for the choice. To stand or to break. The ghost of the mining array fracture whispered in his ear. This time he wouldn't be at the controls. This time he would be the point of impact. The creature was almost on him. The air hummed with its momentum. The crystalline tips of its limbs were inches from his chest. This was it. The conclusion. The final data point in the experiment. The planet would record his death as a confirmed result. Another fragile thing, broken. Nixara watched, her golden face a mask of cold certainty. She was ready to turn away. The test was over. Every muscle fiber screamed for him to run. It was the logical move, the only move. It offered distance, a chance to reassess, a slim hope of finding shelter. His body, trained on Earth for self-preservation, leaned into the impulse. Adrenaline flooded his system, sharpening the world into a series of escape routes, but his feet didn't move. The command from his brain never reached them. He was already dead. That was the simple, brutal truth of it. His life had ended months ago in the cold silence of a breached mining corridor. The man who crawled from the Artemis was a ghost carrying a corpse. The planet's gravity, the toxic air, the Golden Hunter's verdict, they were just echoes of a sentence already passed. He had been living on borrowed time, and the debt was due. To run now would be an admission. It would mean accepting Nixara's cold assessment as fact. It would mean agreeing with the planet's hostile design that he was flawed, weak, meant to break. It would validate the entire chain of events that started with his failure on Europa. His fragility would become the final word in his story. That was a surrender his ghosts would not allow. Lyra's memory deserved more than a man who ran. Cassandra's laughter deserved more than a father who accepted his own weakness. His failure had taken everything from him. His home, his purpose, his family. It had stripped him down to raw nerve and bone. But it would not take this one final choice, this last act of defiance. It was the only thing he had left that truly belonged to him. The memory of their bodies, of the sudden, crushing silence that followed the bulkhead's collapse, did not bring him sadness. It brought a terrible, focused strength. It was a cold fire in his veins, hotter than adrenaline, more durable than hope. It was the strength of a man who has nothing left to lose because he has already lost everything. There was no fear in it. Fear was for those who still had a future to protect. He didn't make a conscious decision. The choice was made for him by the past. It was made by the weight of a dead family on his shoulders. It was made by the echo of a laugh he would never hear again. His body turned toward the charging beast without a single thought passing through his mind. It was a reflex born of grief and guilt. He was not a survivor turning to fight. He was a monument to failure turning to meet its shadow. The beast was not a predator. It was a final judgment, and he would not run from judgment again. He settled his weight, his earth-born bones groaning in protest, and waited for the impact. There was no plan, no technique, only a silent, stubborn refusal to accept one more verdict of weakness. The planet expected him to break. He intended to disappoint it. The impact drove the air from his lungs. The creature's weight was immense, a solid mass of muscle and alien density. Under Nexus Prime's gravity, its mass was a crushing force. Human biology offered no answer for this. His skeleton, designed for a single gravity, should have folded. His muscles, earth-conditioned and already torn from the strain of simple walking, should have shredded. Physics and biology both agreed on the outcome. It was a closed case. His hands found purchase on the rough, scaly hide. He didn't think about lifting. He simply pushed. His body became a single focused act of defiance. Adrenaline flooded his system, a chemical surge that bypassed pain and fatigue. It was a primal override, a system-wide alert that temporarily ignored the structural limits of bone and sinew. This hysterical strength was a finite resource, a last-ditch effort from a body pushed to its absolute breaking point. Blood flow to his muscles increased sharply, feeding them a final desperate burst of energy. He wasn't lifting a predator. He was lifting the weight of the stabilization strut on the Europa mining hub. He was lifting the silence that followed the bulkhead's failure. He was lifting the crushing guilt of 2 lives lost because of his miscalculation. Every ounce of strain was a down payment on a debt he could never fully repay. The pain in his shoulders was the pain of Lyra's last look. The fire in his legs was the memory of Cassandra's laugh being cut short. This physical agony was just an echo of a deeper, more permanent hurt. The beast thrashed in his grip, its 6 limbs churning the air. Its crystalline claws scraped against his environmental suit, seeking a hold. It was a half-metric-ton engine of destruction, perfectly adapted to this world, and it was confused. Its simple predatory logic had no category for this response. Prey was supposed to flee or freeze. It did not grab and lift. This defiance was an error in its programming. The creature's multifaceted eyes fixed on him, not with rage, but with a sudden, sharp curiosity. He held it. For 7 heartbeats, each one was a hard, percussive thump in his ears, a drumbeat counting down his body's remaining functionality. Each second was a direct challenge to the planet's crushing pull. His limbs shook with a fatigue so deep it felt like his bones were vibrating. Perspiration cascaded down his face, stinging his eyes. His vision narrowed to a tunnel, the edges going gray. This wasn't about winning a fight. It was a transaction. He was trading every bit of his physical integrity, every reserve of his body's strength for one single moment of truth. He was proving something not to the beast or to Nixara, but to the ghost of the man he used to be. The pain was total. It was a white-hot sheet across his back and down his arms. It was the specific, grinding sensation of vertebrae compressing under an impossible load. It was the burning tear of muscle fibers separating from bone. It was absolute. And it was nothing. It was a shallow, fleeting hurt compared to the permanent hollow ache he carried in his chest every waking moment. That memory was the true weight, and he had been carrying it for months. Lifting this beast was easy. Living with his failure was the hard part. He held it until the world began to dissolve into a roaring silence. His body pushed so far past its limits that it began to shut down. The beast hung in the air, suspended not just by his failing muscles but by the sheer strangeness of the moment. Its amber eyes, multifaceted and ancient, locked onto his. The raw fury and predatory drive drained from its gaze. It did not thrash. It became still. The fight left its huge frame. It was no longer an enemy. It was a witness to an impossibility. The struggle between them changed. It was no longer a predator hunting prey. It became a silent dialogue. A conversation between two different kinds of power. One power was innate. It was born of this hostile world. A product of crystalline adaptation and generations of evolutionary pressure. It was clean, efficient, and inevitable. The other power was messy and human. It was forged in loss and failure, fueled by desperation and a refusal to accept one more verdict of weakness. It was not a strength of body, but a strength of will. The beast saw the strain on his face. It felt the violent tremors in the arms that held it. It registered the obvious physical fragility, the human design so ill-suited to this place. But it also saw past that. It saw the core of the man. It saw the raw, stubborn refusal to break. It recognized a different kind of strength. Not the smooth, adapted power of a native, but the hard, ugly, clawed out of the dirt defiance of a survivor. It was a power the creature had never encountered. A moment of pure, silent recognition passed between them. The predator's 8 amber eyes narrowed slightly, not in aggression, but in assessment. It was a recalibration. Its initial programming had been to eliminate a malfunction. That assessment was now null. This was not a malfunction. This was a new variable. An anomaly that did not compute. The man was not strong, but he was not weak. He was something else entirely. It was predator acknowledging predator. But the nature of the hunt was different. One hunted for sustenance, for the primal need to feed and dominate its territory. The other hunted for a different purpose. He hunted for redemption. He sought to atone for a past failure by defying the one in front of him. The beast understood the language of the hunt, and it recognized a fellow hunter even if the quarry was different. The silence that fell over the clearing was thick. It wasn't a silence of fear or submission. It was the heavy, thoughtful silence of a system rebooting. The planet's logic, so absolute and cruel, had encountered a paradox, a fragile thing that would not break. The rules had to be rewritten. Nixara watched, her golden skin seeming to pale in the dim light. Her sharp intake of breath was the only sound. Her lips, which had been curved in a smirk of cold certainty, parted slightly. The laughter that had been ready to escape died before it began, choked off by the sheer impossibility of what she was seeing. Her entire worldview, built on the simple, unshakable truth that off-worlders break, fractured. The data did not support her conclusion. The evidence was right in front of her, holding half a ton of living fury in the air through sheer impossible will. Her mind, a razor-sharp instrument of logic and survival, scrambled for a new category to put him in. He no longer fit the definition of prey. Nixara's entire existence was built on a simple, unshakable rule. Off-worlders break. Their bones give way. Their spirit shatters. It was a fundamental law of her world. She had seen it time and again. Their technology failed. Their bodies collapsed. They were temporary disruptions, quickly erased by the planet's relentless pressure. Her role as a hunter was not about conquest. It was about confirming this natural order. She was a witness to inevitability. Marcus didn't break. He didn't shatter. He did something far more unsettling. He bent. The rules of physics, the limits of biology, they didn't snap for him. They warped. He stood there holding half a ton of living predator in the air, his body screaming in protest but not giving in. It was a violation of everything she knew. A crack in the foundation of her reality. She didn't see a strong man. She saw a man who, by every measure of her understanding, should have been weak. His physiology was a catalogue of flaws. His skeleton lacked the necessary crystalline lattice for reinforcement. His lung tissue was being slowly dissolved by the atmosphere. His heart was a muscle straining under a gravity it was never meant to endure. The evidence was all there. The data was perfect. The conclusion was wrong. He was the exception that invalidated the rule. Her mocking confidence evaporated. It didn't turn to admiration. It turned to a sharp, cold confusion. Her mind, a weapon honed for survival logic, scrambled for a new category. He didn't fit. He wasn't prey. Prey runs, prey hides. He had done neither. He hadn't even fought in a way she recognized. It wasn't a display of superior strength. It was a display of impossible defiance. Her expression shifted from a smirk of certainty to a tight line of calculation. This was a new variable. An unknown. This wasn't respect, not yet. Respect implied a positive judgment. This was the raw shock of a fundamental law being broken. It was the disorienting feeling of the ground giving way under a philosophy you thought was solid rock. Her obsidian eyes, which had once looked through him, now studied him. They scanned the tremors in his arms, the set of his jaw, the sheer will holding his broken body together. She was reassessing, recalibrating. If her initial assessment was wrong, then all her assumptions were suspect. If he wasn't weak, then what was he? The planet itself had thrown its worst at him. The gravity, the toxins, a native predator. It had failed to kill him. Her own judgment, her sentinel's certainty had failed to define him. He was no longer a subject in her world's natural order. He was an anomaly, a problem. And problems, for a mind like hers, required new solutions. The hunter's gaze softened from dismissal to intense, focused scrutiny. The game had changed. The rules were being rewritten right in front of her, and she needed to learn them fast. He had not earned her respect. He had earned her full, undivided attention, the kind of attention she gave to a storm on the horizon or a fresh predator track. It was the beginning of a much more complicated story. The ground split without warning. A jagged line tore through the dark soil, widening into a chasm in seconds. The earth didn't just crack. It betrayed them. The solid ground under their feet became a crumbling edge. A deep sulfuric stench hit the air, a toxic breath from the planet's core. Yellow plumes of vapor erupted from the fissure, hot and corrosive. The air filled with the acrid smell of rotten eggs and chemical burn. Their personal standoff evaporated. The silent tension between human and hunter became irrelevant. The planet had introduced a new, more immediate problem. They shared a single priority now. Not winning, not arguing, not proving a point, not dying. Survival software overrode everything else. Two different operating systems faced the same critical error. Marcus's eyes met Nixara's. No words passed between them. There was no time for negotiation. His earth-honed instincts, trained for crisis management and structural failure, calculated the rate of the chasm's expansion. He saw the unstable lip of the fissure, the way the ground crumbled inward. He assessed the trajectory of the sulfur clouds, the dead air where the vapors pooled. His mind mapped escape vectors in a split second. Nixara's native knowledge provided the data his assessment lacked. Her amber eyes scanned the surrounding flora. She didn't see a wall of alien plants. She saw a network, a latticework of thick, crystalline vines and overlapping giant leaves that formed a natural bridge over the treacherous terrain. She knew which growths were strong enough to bear weight. She knew which ones were brittle or carried their own defensive toxins. Her understanding of the jungle's architecture was instantaneous, a language she'd spoken since birth. It wasn't a partnership. It wasn't friendship. It was a temporary merger of processing power. His calculation met her terrain data. The conclusion was unanimous. The only viable exit was up and across into the complex web of the crystalline flora. The alternative was a fall into the steaming fissure or suffocation by the sulfurous emissions. The choice was simple. Move or be erased, he nodded once. A short, sharp motion. She tilted her head toward a specific cluster of interwoven vines. A command. An agreement. They moved at the same time. No discussion. No hesitation. They launched themselves toward the living lattice. Their leap was a synchronized act of desperation. A shared escape velocity born of pure necessity. The crystalline vines were rough and cool under his hands. They flexed but held. The structure groaned under their combined weight, but the native growth was built for this world's stresses. They climbed, not as allies, but as two independent systems utilizing the same solution. He focused on his handholds, his muscles burning. She moved ahead, her movements fluid and certain, clearing a path. The sulphurous plumes rose around them, stinging their eyes and coating their throats with a burning film. Below, the chasm widened, swallowing the ground where they had just stood. The pact between them was sealed not with a handshake or a promise. It was sealed by the shared sound of their labored breathing. It was sealed by the mutual understanding that the ground itself was an enemy. Their alliance was a temporary truce with an expiration date. It would last exactly as long as the immediate threat. But for now, they were a single unit, climbing for their lives against a planet that had just tried to kill them both. The jungle watched, impartial. The test had simply changed form. The jungle became a testing ground. Nexus Prime sent one challenge after another. The first was a plant. It looked like a cluster of giant pitcher plants, their mouths wide and glistening. One of the vines shot out faster than a striking snake. It wrapped around the small drone unit, Taya, and began to pull it toward the digestive pool. It was a test. Not of strength, but of loyalty. Would he risk himself for a machine? He didn't think, he moved. His hands grabbed the vine. The surface was covered in a corrosive sap that burned his gloves. He planted his feet and pulled. It was a contest of raw force against botanical strength. Nixara didn't hesitate either. She found a long, dry branch and jammed it into the plant's central stalk. She knew its weakness. The plant recoiled, its grip loosening just enough for him to wrench Taya free. The drone's casing was scored with acid burns, but it was intact. Then the aerial hunters came. They descended from the canopy in a tight, coordinated formation. Their wings made a sound like tearing canvas. They dove, their attack patterns aggressive. This was a test of coordinated defense. They came from multiple angles. Nixara called out vectors, her voice sharp and clear. Her warrior training provided the tactical overlay. She identified the primary threat, the flanking maneuvers. Marcus's earth-honed instincts provided the reaction. He didn't see individual creatures. He saw a system of attack. He calculated trajectories, intercept points. He used a fallen log as a barricade, timing his movements to their dives. He grabbed a heavy rock-like fruit and hurled it. His aim was poor under the high gravity, but the throw disrupted their formation. It created an opening. Nixara used it. She moved with a fluid precision, her crystalline blade a blur, deflecting strikes and creating space. They weren't talking. They were operating. His calculation and her discipline merged into a single, efficient process. He saw a fissure open up under Nixara's feet as she fought. The ground gave way. She started to drop into a crevasse lined with sharp, crystalline shards. He lunged, his body screaming in protest. He caught her forearm just as she fell. His grip was pure desperation. He hauled her back onto solid ground. It was a physical answer to her earlier mockery. A rebuttal written in action, not words. Every step through the emerald hell was a new choice. Self-preservation said to move fast, leave the drone, let the hunter fend for herself. Cooperation said to watch each other's backs, share the burden, move as a unit. He chose cooperation. Each time. When Taya's motivator failed, he carried the drone. When a sulfur vent threatened to overwhelm them, she guided them to clear air through a path he never would have seen. They weren't becoming friends. They were becoming a single survival instrument. His raw power and crisis management, her environmental mastery and tactical grace. The jungle was their brutal instructor, and every new danger was a final exam question. They passed, but each test extracted a price. His muscles were shredding. Her reserves were draining. But the unit held. It became stronger with each challenge. The fragile pact forged in the chasm was being tempered in fire. It was no longer about a temporary truce. It was about becoming something new, something the planet hadn't accounted for, a hybrid system built for one purpose, to endure. The walls of Elder Corvus's settlement looked strong. They were built from interwoven crystalline trees and packed earth. A safe harbor in the endless emerald hostility. It was a lie. The real weakness wasn't the walls. It was inside them. The poison wasn't in the air. It was in the trust. A scout named Kale greeted them. He had a warm smile and steady hands. He offered them clean water. He showed them the watch rotations. He pointed out the best defensive positions. His eyes were friendly, but his hands were busy. While he talked, he sharpened a knife. The whetstone made a soft, rhythmic sound. It was the sound of preparation. He wasn't preparing to defend the settlement. He was preparing for something else. The betrayal wasn't loud. It was a quiet thing. A whispered conversation in shadow. A signal fire lit on a still night. A map passed to the wrong hands. The scout provided the Ravagers with everything they needed. He gave them the patrol schedules. He showed them the weak points in the wall. He told them when the guards changed shifts. He was a leak in the hull of a ship. The danger wasn't the storm outside. It was the water slowly filling the belly of the ship. He did it for a simple, ugly reason. He thought the old ways were finished. He saw Elder Corvus's traditions as a weakness. A relic. He wanted power. A new order. He believed the Ravagers were the future. He said the words himself later when the truth came out. I betrayed Elder Corvus. The ancient ways are obsolete. It was a death sentence for the community, delivered with a shrug. The Ravager attack wasn't random. It wasn't a raid. It was a surgical strike. They knew exactly where to hit. They knew when the guards would be looking the other way. They moved with a confidence that came from perfect intelligence. The attack was just the symptom. The scout was the disease. The cancer was inside the body, eating it from within. Marcus understood this evil. It was familiar. The planet's brutality was honest. It was a force of nature. This was different. This was a choice. A person choosing to sell out their own for personal gain. He had faced it before in boardrooms and on mining crews. Greed disguised as ambition. Cowardice disguised as pragmatism. This was a fight he knew how to win. It wasn't about lifting a beast. It was about finding a traitor. The settlement didn't just need a defender to fight the Ravagers at the gate. It needed a surgeon to cut out the infection first. The fight for survival became a fight for the community's soul. Could they trust each other? Could they heal from a wound made by one of their own? The external threat was massive, but the internal betrayal was the thing that could truly destroy them. It was a poison in the well. You can't fight a war if you can't drink the water. Marcus looked at the friendly faces around the fire. He listened to their laughter. He saw the scout Kale smiling, sharing a story. The knife was still in his hand. The settlement was a body. The enemy was in the bloodstream. The fight was no longer about muscle and bone. It was about finding the sickness before it killed the host. The high walls meant nothing if the door was unlocked from the inside. The sound of the Ravager horns cut through the jungle. They were close. The scouts had failed to hold the perimeter. The outer wall would not last. A familiar shadow moved at the edge of the tree line. The predator. It watched the chaos with its ancient amber eyes. It was separate from the fight. An observer, Marcus saw it, but he didn't see a threat. He saw an opportunity. The Ravagers were expecting a defense. They were expecting barricades and arrows. They were not expecting what he was thinking. He didn't plan to tame the beast. That implied dominance. He planned to negotiate. He would offer a deal. He moved toward it. The beast's head turned. Its crystalline limbs shifted. It remembered him. The memory was not of a fight, but of a standoff. A moment of mutual, impossible recognition. He stood before it, his hands open. He didn't speak. He pointed. He gestured toward the Ravager lines. He made a sweeping motion with his arm. A direction, a purpose. He was offering it a target for its aggression, a channel for its predatory nature. The Ravagers were invaders in its territory. They were noise and disruption. He was giving it permission to do what it did best, but with a specific focus. It was a partnership of convenience. He would guide. It would destroy. The beast's multifaceted eyes fixed on the charging Ravagers. It saw the chaos. It understood the threat to its domain. It lowered its head. A low rumble came from its chest. It was not a growl of menace. It was an agreement. A contract accepted. It stepped forward, allowing him to grip the thick, scaly hide behind its cranial ridge. He pulled himself onto its back. The position was precarious. There were no saddles, no reins. His legs clamped against its sides. His hands held onto natural protrusions. The beast moved. It did not buck him off. It understood the arrangement. They were a single weapon now. It charged. The ground shook. The Ravagers saw it coming. Their formation, tight and aggressive moments before, wavered. Their spears were meant for human targets. They were useless against half a ton of armored fury. The beast hit their line like a living avalanche. It didn't bite or slash. It simply drove through them. Its mass and momentum were the weapons. Bodies were thrown aside. Shields splintered. Marcus held on. The world was a violent blur. He wasn't fighting. He was steering. He leaned his weight, directing the creature's charge toward the heaviest concentrations of enemy warriors. He became its tactical mind. It became his physical force. A fallen Ravager's axe was on the ground. He snatched it as they passed. The weapon felt crude and heavy in his hand. He used it to strike at enemies who got too close, adding his own force to the creature's devastating charge. They tore through the enemy ranks. The Ravagers, so confident seconds before, broke. They had no counter for this. They could fight men. They could not fight a force of nature. The beast's charge provided a critical advantage. It created a rupture in the assault, a gap that the settlement's defenders could exploit. This was the final answer to Nixara's first judgment. He was not fragile. His strength was not in his bones. It was in his ability to see potential where others saw only threat. He didn't conquer the beast with muscle. He recruited it with strategy. He turned the planet's own native fury against the invaders. It was the ultimate refutation. A man who should be broken was now riding a weapon no one saw coming. The fight ended in the deep water channel that bordered the settlement. The ground gave way under their feet. The world became cold and dark and silent. The rules of combat changed the moment they submerged. The water was dense. It resisted movement. Powerful strikes became slow, weak pushes. The commander's physical size, his heavy muscle mass, became a liability. It dragged him down. He fought the water as much as he fought Marcus, his movements clumsy and inefficient. His strength, so overwhelming on land, was neutralized. The water didn't care about his adaptations. It only cared about efficiency and control. Marcus's body was already a collection of aches and microfractures. The cold water was a shock. It seeped into his suit, into his bones. But his desperation was a fuel that burned even here. It was a universal currency. It spent just as well underwater. His need to survive, to protect the settlement, to finally prove he was not defined by his failure, was a fire the cold couldn't extinguish. He didn't have the commander's power. He had a deeper, more primal resource, an absolute refusal to die in this channel. It became a raw contest of will. A test of who wanted to live more. The commander fought for conquest. He wanted victory over a weak off-worlder and control of a new territory. His motivation was external. Marcus fought for redemption. He fought for the ghosts of his family. He fought for the people behind the settlement walls. He fought to prove to himself that his life still had meaning. His motivation was a core-deep imperative. One man fought for gain. The other fought for his soul. The commander grabbed Marcus's throat. His grip was powerful even underwater. But Marcus's hands found the commander's wrists. His grip was the same grip that had held the living predator aloft against impossible gravity. It was a grip forged in the memory of loss. It was a grip that said no. He would not be strangled. He would not be beaten. He would not add another failure to his record. The commander's eyes, wide with surprise and the first flicker of doubt, met his. The man he thought was fragile was not breaking. They sank deeper. The light from the surface faded to a dull green glow. The current pulled at them. The commander's movements became more frantic. He was a creature of the land, confused and disoriented. He was running out of air. Marcus held on. His lungs burned. His vision started to tunnel. But he held. He didn't try to overpower the commander. He simply held him there in the cold, dark silence. He outlasted him. The commander's thrashing slowed. His grip on Marcus's throat loosened. The fight left his body. He stopped moving. Marcus pushed away from the lifeless form. He kicked for the surface. His body screamed for oxygen. His muscles felt like lead. He broke the surface with a ragged, gasping breath. The air had never tasted so clean. He floated for a moment, just breathing. The sounds of battle from the settlement had changed. The defensive horns were sounding a different note. A note of holding. A note of a threat contained. He hadn't won the fight through superior strength or skill. He had simply refused to lose it. He had held on 1 second longer. He had wanted life 1 degree more. The water had been the great equalizer, stripping away all advantages until only will remained. And his will, tempered in the fire of his greatest failure, had been the stronger one. He dragged himself onto the muddy bank. His body was broken, exhausted, freezing, but the settlement was still standing. He had done his part. The fight for the channel was over. The fight for his place in this new world was just beginning. Some might tell it as a gentle arrival, a soft landing, That version is a lie. There was nothing gentle about it. It was a violent stripping away. The gravity didn't welcome him. It reached inside his bones and tried to crush them. The air didn't fill his lungs. It burned them with every breath. Every movement was a negotiation with pain. His muscles screamed under the load. They tore and they burned. The planet was not a sanctuary. It was an opponent. It assessed him and found him weak. It tried to break him down into his component parts. The physical agony was only half of it. The other half was memory. He carried his dead family with him. Their absence was a heavier gravity. It pulled at his spirit. Every labored step was a reminder of the steps he didn't take back on Europa. Every moment of pain was an echo of their silence. His arrival was an autopsy performed by an alien world. It cut him open and left his failures exposed for everything to see. What remained after that violent process was a raw core. A stubborn, defiant piece of himself that refused to be erased. It was the same core that had faced the control panel on the mining hub and known his mistake a second too late. It was the part of him that could absorb infinite guilt and still choose to move forward. That core was all that was left. It was the foundation. It was the only thing strong enough to lift a living predator against impossible odds. That act of defiance was not a beginning. It was a confirmation. It proved that the violent forging had worked. The planet had not destroyed him. It had remade him. It had burned away everything that was unnecessary. Everything that was soft. Everything that was from a different life. What stood in the jungle that day was a new thing. A man forged in loss and pain and high gravity. The story of a gentle arrival is for people who weren't there. It is a story told by those who only saw the end result. They see the settlement and the hybrid children and the knowledge shared. They see the peace and they assume it came easily. They did not feel the grind of bone. They did not taste the poison air. They did not carry the weight of 2 lost lives into a fight against a crystalline beast. The truth is written in the body. It is in the slight limp that never quite left his right leg. It is in the way his shoulders are permanently set from years of fighting the pull of the planet. It is in the deep lines on his face carved by grief and hard choices. It is in the quiet that sometimes settles in his eyes, a look that speaks of a cost that was paid in full. He did not arrive on Nexus Prime. He was unmade and then remade there. He was forged in a fire that would have consumed a lesser man. The gentlest arrival is a pleasant story. The truth is much more interesting. The final image is not a battlefield. It is a structure built from interwoven crystal and wood and stone, a knowledge repository. It stands at the heart of the settlement, a quiet testament to everything they've learned. Inside, the air is cool and still. Light filters through carefully positioned prisms, illuminating shelves of etched slates and datapads salvaged from the Artemis. This is where the story is kept. Not as a myth, but as a manual. Marcus's life of loss yielded a single, lasting gift. It was not a weapon. It was a purpose. He took a fragment of the Predator's own crystalline horn, the creature they now called the Thantor. He shaped it with tools he made himself, his hands remembering the strain of holding the beast aloft. He gave the finished talisman to Nyxara. It was small enough to fit in her palm, a perfect miniature of the creature that first tested them. It was not a trophy. It was an acknowledgement, a symbol that their greatest threat had become their most profound teacher. This act marked the final shift, the move from one man's search for redemption to a community's shared commitment to survival. Inside the repository, Earth science and Nexus Prime wisdom sit side by side. There is no separation. A slate etched with diagrams of structural bracing rests next to a basket of humming crystals that foretell seismic shifts. A child learns to calculate load-bearing stress using local materials, and then learns to identify the specific vine whose sap can seal a wound against infection. The curriculum is hybrid by necessity. It is the only way to build a future here. This knowledge is their true defense. Stronger than any wall, Nyxara's eyes have changed. The hard suspicion that once narrowed them is gone. It has been replaced by a different warmth, the warmth of history shared. She looks at the talisman in her hand, then at the lines of concentration on Marcus's face as he explains a power grid schematic to a group of young builders. Her expression holds a quiet respect forged in the fire of their first impossible alliance. It is the look of someone who has seen a fundamental law broken and helped write the new one. Their story is not told as a hero's journey. It is recited as a series of lessons, a chapter on atmospheric toxins, a section on predator behavior, a footnote on the properties of crystalline structures under pressure. The tale of the man who lifted the Thantor is used to teach the principles of leverage and hysterical strength. The memory of the mining array fracture is a mandatory lesson in systems failure and preventative maintenance. The deepest wound became the strongest shield. The pain of the past was processed into a protocol for the future. The narrative finds its completion not in a victory celebration, but in the quiet hum of the repository at dusk. It is in the sight of a new generation that moves through the Emerald Jungle not with fear, but with a profound and practical understanding. They respect its hazards. They utilize its resources. They are native to this synthesis. The violent crash of the Artemis was not an end. It was a brutal, painful, and necessary first breath. The first breath of a world that never should have worked but did. He didn't find strength by avoiding the break. He found it in the defiance he built from the pieces. His story shows that some catastrophic landings were in their unique way the gentlest of arrivals. The planet forged him in its fire until only his core remained. A new story begins where that one ends. Subscribe to see where it leads. Remember this. What looks like a gentle arrival is often just the quiet after a violent rebirth. The kind that leaves a man forever changed.